Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to this fourth and final installment of our conversations about race for this iteration. I mean, I expect that we'll do something like this again as we move forward. Today, we're excited to have Charles Rotrammel with us. Charles is the CEO of Houston Revision. He'll tell you more about Houston Revision, but it's a nonprofit in Houston that we started together there, and so he'll talk about that work and issues related to the school to prison pipeline and all other kinds of things that I think we'll be interested in. And so there's a lot of content for today, and we want to leave time for Q&A. And so just in a moment, I'll ask Charles to step up and begin conversation. We are recording this as we always do, and so it's available online for you to view, again, for you to pass along to friends, and I hope that you will do that. And so without further ado, why don't we welcome Mr. Charles Rotrammel. Take it away, Charles.
Have to turn myself on here. Hey, thank you so much. Thank you, Justin. So my name is Charles Rotrammel, as Justin mentioned, and I'm the CEO of a nonprofit in Houston called Houston Revision. As Justin mentioned, we began this endeavor together in 2011, and still going. It's still alive. Houston Revision's work is primarily with kids in the juvenile justice system. So my universe is the juvenile justice universe. I've worked with juvenile justice kids for more than 30 years. And so my entry into the education space is through that lens, because our kids have a very similar story oftentimes, and that is that they enter the juvenile justice system after entering the discipline system in school. And so many of you I know are educators, part of schools, have been educators, have been on the school board. So I'm going to be talking about issues that you deal with, you have dealt with, you've struggled with. I'm going to be talking about national issues. I'm going to be talking about North Carolina and Chapel Hill issues. We'll drill down into a lot of data and a lot of statistics. I'll make this presentation available. Justin will have this, so if you'd like to refer back to it, we'll make it available to you. But what I hope to do today is to really give you a fresh view of some of the issues that we've been struggling with in this community, and some potential solutions that might not have been attempted before. So hopefully by the end, we'll have some hope. We'll go through a dark period at the beginning of the presentation, though, because we've got to look at the problem, right? We've got to look at the whole scope of what we're dealing with. And I'll have, as Justin mentioned, I'll have time for questions at the end, so we'll make sure that we make that available. So if we're going to talk about juvenile justice, if we're going to talk about the school to prison pipeline, if we're going to talk about the student achievement gap, we've got to think about this construct of juvenile delinquency, right? This is a construct that exists, that has been created over a period of time. It hasn't always existed. It's very important to recognize that this language around the delinquent juvenile is not a historic phenomenon. It was created, it was a social construct that was created in the mid-20th century. And there's a lot of words that accrete to this concept of juvenile delinquency. When I use that word, juvenile delinquency, you conjure in your mind a certain image. And that image is probably of a certain type of a person, right? This graphic here is just an indication of some of the other words that accrete to that construct of juvenile delinquency. The juvenile delinquent ends up in this place, incarcerated, right? Often as a juvenile, because of violations of policy in schools, because of violations of laws, because of their behavior. And the issue with this kid being locked up in this place is he's part of a much larger problem, right? It's not just about him, it's about the bigger picture. And so we have to talk about incarceration. We live in the era of mass incarceration. You've heard this language. You're familiar with this terminology. Well, the kids that we work with, the kids that I'm talking about, are part of that mass incarceration system, right? The United States has 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's incarcerated population. This is a new phenomenon. It hasn't always happened. In 1972, the United States incarcerated 300,000 people. Today, we incarcerate 2,300,000 people. That is not incidentally because of an increase in violent crime. Actually, crime peaked. Violent crime in particular peaked in what year? 1995. And it's been going down ever since, year by year by year, and yet the incarceration rate has been going up through that whole period of time. I'm going to recommend a couple of books in this presentation, and the first I'm going to recommend to you to get a really complete view of the history of how we got here is Elizabeth Hinton's book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime. Elizabeth Hinton is a professor at Harvard, and this is a text that's really I think the most compelling that I have read on this topic, because it takes it from the history after World War II all the way through the current time and shows us how we got to the place that we are today. Not just around incarceration, but also around school discipline and school achievement issues. But part of that is a history that I want to begin with today, because I think it's an important history that I didn't know, and I think most of us might not know. So in 1961, President Kennedy formed the very first committee on juvenile delinquency and youth crime, right? That was the first time that the government had used this terminology about delinquency. It's probably important to point out that this committee was made up of entirely white men, and what they did is they identified pathology as the cause of crime, particularly the pathology of the African American family. This is the language that they used, the pathology of the African American family. And so African American youth became seen by this committee as a problem to be solved. And they prescribed a set of solutions for that problem. Fast forward to 1964, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote this paper called The Negro Family. And he wrote, in a word, most Negro youth are in danger of being caught up in a tangle of pathology that affects their world, and probably a majority are so entrapped. Think the language here, right? The language. Many of those who escape do so for one generation only. As things are now, their children may have to run the gauntlet all over again. That is not the least vicious aspect of the world that white America has made for the Negro. So this language is saying that we're going to judge this entire group of people and say that they are pathological, right? And that we have to solve that pathology. Well, the problem with that is that it doesn't offer a solution, right? It creates a set of definitions that we are still living with today, because it created a pathway where we began to see these African American young men in particular as problematic, and we began to see them as even the enemy shortly after Moynihan wrote that, because the Black Panther movement started shortly after that. And so this created a scenario where we began to incarcerate more and more people. There was a movement in the criminology field shortly after this, in the early 70s, called the Nothing Works movement. And you might remember this. So in the Nothing Works movement, some writers from Stanford wrote these papers that said that nothing in the criminal justice field works. You can't rehabilitate people, you can't change people's lives, you can't do anything. Nothing works. The only thing that would work is incapacitation. That was the word that they used. Incapacitation. And so that justified the massive increase in the building of prisons, the passing of laws that entangled more and more people in the criminal justice system. As a response to this concept of pathology, right? Well, if these people are pathological and they're scary and we should be scared of them, then the only thing that we can do is incapacitate them. So that's how we got to the 2 million person increase in the incarcerated population in essentially 20 years, from the mid-70s to the mid-90s. There is a massive overrepresentation in our criminal justice system, all the way through the criminal justice system, of African Americans. This is not unique to North Carolina. It is, however, present in North Carolina. So these are North Carolina statistics, actually from 2010. It's gotten slightly better. It's gotten slightly better all over the country, and it's gotten slightly better in North Carolina. However, as you can see, the overrepresentation, this is white, Hispanic, black, American, Native American. The overrepresentation of African Americans in the North Carolina criminal justice system is massive. It's massive in Texas too, but it's a real problem. And the percentage of the population of the incarcerated in North Carolina that's African American is 55%. 55% of incarcerated North Carolinians are African American. Only 36% are white. Again, this is not unique to North Carolina. It's a national problem. Black males in the United States are incarcerated 5 times more than white males. This is true all over the country. But I want you to see this as part of a, it didn't happen in a vacuum. This happened because a certain line of thought began in the early 60s, and it carried through to its logical conclusion, which is we have to get more and more of these folks to be incapacitated. Well, they're incapacitated now, right? 1 in 10 North Carolina African American males is likely to have a parent who is incarcerated. 1 in 60 North Carolinian white males is likely to have a parent incarcerated. That's the difference. That's the stark difference. Well, it comes down into the school system as well. That whole line of thinking that started with the criminal justice system pushed all the way down into our public schools. And it falls right on the back of African Americans in our public schools. And it started really with this idea of zero tolerance that began in the 90s, right? Before Columbine, in 94, you'll remember this. Many of us in this room, I will say, will remember this. That there was a fear about school safety. That was when the fear about school safety began. And so the idea became that we needed to exhibit zero tolerance for negative behavior on our school campuses as a way to keep them safe. And in fact, the federal government required that. School districts and states had to adopt zero tolerance policies or they couldn't get federal money anymore. So what are zero tolerance policies? So zero tolerance is a philosophy, zero tolerance is a philosophy or policy that mandates the application of predetermined consequences. That's the key. The consequences are predetermined. If you do this, then you're going to have to suffer this consequence. They're not individualized. They're most often severe and punitive in nature that are intended to be applied regardless of the seriousness of the behavior, mitigating circumstances, or situational context. So in other words, if I get into a fight, I will be suspended from school, right? This is the most common example. Now, when many of us in this room went to high school, there were fights oftentimes. In my high school in Texas, I saw fights virtually every day, and I didn't know anybody that ever got suspended. That wasn't the circumstance then. But now, the circumstances have changed. And so this concept of zero tolerance is all wrapped up with the broken windows theory of crime. And it assumes that the removal of disruptive students deters others from similar conduct while enhancing the classroom. So that's the idea. It's the good of the many outweighs the good of the few. So if we have problems in our classrooms, then the best way to handle that is to remove the problem, right? It seems like common sense. And it is something that's been in place. It hasn't been in place forever, but it's been in place for a number of years in our public schools. And again, not just here in North Carolina, but all over the country. And it's been codified in student codes of conduct, starting in the mid-90s around the country. This is where the federal government had an impact, because they said you have to change your student code of conduct in order to continue to receive federal funds. And so these boilerplate student codes of conduct got adopted by school boards all over the country. And they all have very similar language. But these codes of conduct are where this zero tolerance policies live, right? They live in these codes of conduct. I'm going to read for you an example of one of these codes of conduct. This is my least favorite Houston area school district's student code of conduct. It's not unusual, except I think it's a little clear. Sometimes the wording is vague. This one is quite specific and broad. No student shall willfully engage in disruptive activity or disrupt a lawful assembly on the property of any public school. So now they're going to define what that conduct is. What is disruptive conduct? Conduct that disrupts educational activities of a school includes, but is not limited to, tardiness, violation of class rules, emission of any means of noise of any intensity that prevents or hinders classroom instruction. So if I emit any noise in the classroom, I should be removed from the classroom, which means I'm suspended from school, right? So this is how we got here. These school code violations result often in court referrals, because often these are tied up with what's called insubordination. And insubordination often leads to court referrals. This also has led to an increase in police on our school campuses, which is a side issue. I'm not going to really talk much about that, but we could get into that. That's a side issue. It's resulted in a drastic increase in suspensions and referrals, and has significantly increased racial and ethnic disparities within those, all over the country. Here, locally in Chapel Hill, yes. In Texas, yes. All over the United States, yes. Dropout rates have increased, and juvenile crime has increased. All as a result of these code of conduct changes. Another thing that these code of conduct changes did was they created alternative schools. District Alternative Education Programs, as they are known, DAEPs. A lot of states required those to be created as a part of these zero tolerance. If a student committed a violation of the student code of conduct, you had to have a place to send them, and so it's a punitive environment, right? It's a school, but it's a school that exists to punish you. It's a school that exists because you have done something wrong. And across the country, these district alternative education programs have become dropout factories. because it's very difficult to make a DAEP be an effective place for students, because the whole idea of you going there is similar to you being incarcerated. It is to put you out, to send you away. And again, African American students are drastically overrepresented in these alternative schools. So this then is the school to prison pipeline. This is the terminology, you've heard this talked about a lot. Well, this is it, right? This is it in action. It is a set of circumstances that exist. So in Chapel Hill Carrboro City Schools, you've got 12,000 students, right? So in the first semester of 2016-2017, you had 1,004 discipline referrals. That's just in one semester, right? Now, it's gotten better. I've become familiar with the restorative justice initiatives that the district has started, and those have worked to some extent. It's come down last school year. There were only 759 discipline referrals in that first semester, so that's good. But again, we've got this problem with the overrepresentation. Of the 1,004, 386 of them were African American, and of the 759, 246 of them were African American. So we've still got this problem with overrepresentation. And 11% of the enrolled students are African American, but 39% of discipline referrals are African American. This is not unique. I want to point that out. This is right in line with national trends, right? This is a problem that everyone is struggling with. And the other problem is Chapel Hill Carrboro students who are African American are 10 times more likely to be suspended than white students. That almost mirrors the national statistic, by the way. In Houston ISD, which is a much bigger school district, 250,000 students, that same statistic is in place. 10 times more African American students are suspended than white students. It's true almost all over the country. And that relates very much to the school climate, right? What sort of climate are we creating for our students? What sort of climate are we creating in our schools? A friend of mine who's an assistant principal really talked to me and gave me an example of what it feels like to be in a school with a high rate of suspensions, especially if you're a member of an ethnic group that is getting suspended a lot. So let's put ourselves in that situation. So you go to work, and you're at your desk, and one day you come in, and the person that has been officing next to you for 3 years is just not there. They're not there anymore. No explanation of why they're not there, they're just not there. And then the next day you come in, and the person that was officing on the other side of you is not there. Right? Just gone, not there. Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to feel about that? Are you going to feel like your job is secure? Nope, you're going to be on LinkedIn. You're going to be updating your resume. You're going to be, maybe going on Indeed and seeing what jobs are available out there, right? That's how you're going to feel. You're going to start to feel shaken a bit. You're going to start to feel like, I'm not so certain that this is going to work out, right? Well, that's the way these students feel in their schools, right? It creates a climate that is hostile. It creates a climate of uncertainty. Is it going to be me next? And that's the way our kids feel. That contributes to the achievement gap issues that I know are really weighing on Chapel Hill Carrboro. It's not the only explanation, but it's part of it that needs to be addressed. The achievement gap is tremendous. 30% in 2016-2017. Again, these numbers have gotten better. 30% of African American youth were college ready, whereas 85% of white youth were college ready. if you're 10 times more likely to be suspended as an African American young man, and your school climate is such that you might not feel entirely welcome, that contributes to these issues. That's part of the problem. There's other parts, and I'm going to get into some other pieces of that. But I don't want to leave this without saying that the school to prison pipeline is a big pipeline. It takes a lot of people into it. It's not just the kids that are on their way to prison. It's the whole climate of the whole school that can be affected by this, or segments of a school, depending on how big the school is. So why do kids get suspended from school? Why do kids get removed? So here are your statistics for that. So disruptive behavior is the primary reason that kids get suspended from school. My favorite is truancy. You're going to be truant from school, so we're going to suspend you. That's smart, right? So now you're missing more instructional time, right? And you've already missed instructional time because you were skipping school. Why do these kids fall behind in school? Right? How many days do we miss? The average length of a suspension is 3 days, right? If we've been truant for 2 or 3 days and then we're suspended for 3 days, now we've missed more than a week of instructional time. And then we come back and we have quizzes and tests and we can't pass them, and then we really start falling behind, right? Fighting, again, as we mentioned before, is a big driver of these suspensions. Harassment, which can be used in a pretty vague way. And it's only when we get down into these single digits where we get into the actual crimes. Drugs on a school campus, thefts, weapons. Those are things that are mandatory removals. But most of the rest of these are discretionary. Yes?
Are those Chapel Cargo mandated?
They are. The law requires, if you violate the law on a school campus, that you would be removed. I think we all understand that, right? I don't think anybody would quibble with that. If you're going to break a law, then something has to be done. But the problem with suspensions and removals is that 80 to 90% of them are discretionary. They are not violations of law. They are not statutorily required. They are at the discretion of the school, and it goes back to that, the policy. It goes back to the Student Code of Conduct. That is what the Student Code of Conduct requires, and so that's what's done. And it's what's been done for some time. The best report that I can refer you to on these issues was done by the Council of State Governments, and it's called Breaking School Rules. So this is a really detailed, researched report. And it actually looks at Texas data, but it's not a Texas study. It looks at Texas data that looks at the tie between student achievement and the juvenile justice system. And so what that study finds is that a student who is suspended one time is 68% more likely to drop out. Let me say that again. A student who is suspended one time is 68% more likely to drop out than a student who has never been suspended. That's a pretty big impact, right? That same study shows that a student who is suspended for a discretionary offense, which remember, as I said, is 85 to 95% of those removals, is 3 times more likely to have contact with the juvenile justice system in the next 12 months. 3 times more likely. So what is the school to prison pipeline? This is it, right? It starts with zero tolerance policies, and it pushes down all the way to these suspensions. And these suspensions lead to falling behind. I'll tell you a story about Isaiah, who's a revision student. So often these suspensions begin in elementary school. Policy allows elementary students to be suspended, and so often they are. This is how the majority of our juvenile justice kids started to have contact with the discipline system in schools. So Isaiah was suspended in the 3rd grade, and he was suspended for 3 days, and it happened to be 3 days that his classmates were learning long division, okay? Well, Isaiah never learned long division, ever. So he got promoted through whatever means, and so he's in the 9th grade now, and he's in algebra class. You can't do algebra if you don't know long division. So he's failing his algebra class, and he's acting out in algebra class to try to make it, to distract the situation. And so he gets put out of class again. And it was when he got put out of class that he got picked up for hanging out with the wrong crowd. So he ended up in the juvenile justice system, even though he's not really a juvenile justice type kid. But it's easy to get caught up. So those suspensions from school are not just a punishment for the behavior. It's actually removing kids from instructional time that is then killing their ability to learn, right? This affects our literacy rates, it affects our graduation rates, it affects our school test scores, it affects all of that because these students are not catching up. They're falling behind and they're not catching up. Did somebody have a question? Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I just had a question about on that first point whether or not the study looked at which was the independent and dependent variable on that school system. In other words, were people that were more likely to drop out also people that were suspended? Or do you necessarily know that the way that the suspension is the defining initial point that led to the dropping out?
They did attempt to control for other factors. I would refer you to the study. They looked at a lot of, they tried to control for a lot of other factors, socioeconomics, criminal record, all kinds of things. But we'd have to dig into the data to really fully answer your question. So I want to talk about some other issues that are important here. Yes, suspensions and removals are crucial, and obviously I think the school-to-prison pipeline begins with those issues. It's not just those issues, though. There are other important factors that we've got to consider. And this issue of school connectedness is something that's, I think, really important and not talked about enough. The Center for Disease Control identified school connectedness as the #1 public health issue facing adolescents in the 21st century. And the Center for Disease Control defines school connectedness like this. School connectedness is the combination of adult support, belonging to a positive peer group, commitment to education, and a positive school environment or a positive school climate, as we were talking about earlier. Those 4 things together lead to school connectedness. School connectedness, in turn, leads to positive educational outcomes. We could guess that, right? The students who feel connected to school, as many of us did when we went to school, will have positive educational outcomes. But it also leads to positive health outcomes. There have been a number of studies, the best of which came out of Chicago in 2014, that show that students who have a high degree of school connectedness exhibit fewer risky behaviors on every measure of risky behavior. So this encompasses everything. This is smoking, substance abuse, teen pregnancy, juvenile delinquency, all kinds of issues. So school connectedness really is the key. If we can get kids to feel connected to school, then we're going to have better outcomes for them all over the board, right? Across the board. And that school connectedness piece is one that often gets lost because as we get caught up in removing kids from school, as we get caught up in, on the other side of things, trying to keep our test scores high, trying to keep our graduation rates high, trying to get as many kids to pass AP classes and all of those kinds of pieces, we can often lose the school connectedness piece for certain students. Certain students in a school feel very connected to the school, but how do we make everyone feel connected? How do we include everyone in that school connectedness piece? That's the challenge. Another piece that I want to bring up is trauma. Again, trauma is an issue that is under-discussed, I think, in a lot of circles, because it affects kids' ability to learn. And some kids come to school having experienced tremendous trauma in their lives, and they have to be dealt with in a different manner than students who have not experienced trauma. And so I want to walk a little bit through that, because I think this is a really important factor as we talk through solutions, right? One of the things that Revision does is we have a soccer team. This is the soccer team. The huge majority of those kids came to the United States as refugees from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And they've been here for 2 to 4 years. We won the state championship last year, by the way. They're really good soccer players. But they experienced trauma, right? All of them experienced tremendous trauma. And so one of them tells this story. He actually wrote this in a paper that he gave me permission to share. So he said, when I was 6, my dad was poisoned his dad was a teacher. His dad was poisoned at a teacher's conference just because the community didn't like him. From that day, I have never felt safe. Most all of the time, I felt lost because no one was there for me. So let's listen to his words, right? From that day, I have never felt safe. That's the definition of trauma, right? Another way to think about trauma is to think about them as adverse childhood experiences. This is the way that research is starting to view trauma, as adverse trauma in childhood and adolescence. So adverse childhood experiences would include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, intimate partner violence. It could include a mother was treated violently. It could include substance misuse in a household. It could include household mental illness. It could include parental separation or divorce or death of a parent. It could include an incarcerated family member, right? These are definitionally what an adverse childhood experience is. So what are the symptoms that go along with having experienced trauma? Well, nightmares, flashbacks. You get into your fight or flight mode. And so you instantly, when faced with some sort of conflict, revert to a fight or flight mentality. Dissociation, trying to get yourself out of a situation. I see this with our soccer kids all the time, is they will go through periods where they just can't be involved. They have to they basically just shut down, right? It might be for a short period of time. It might just be for a few minutes, or it might be for an hour. But they just can't interact with anyone. They just shut down. They're reliving it in their mind, and they can't have other stimuli. They can be hyper-aroused. They can misinterpret cues. This happens a lot with kids who have experienced trauma. This happens with our soccer kids a lot. They misinterpret cues that other kids would maybe interpret. We don't mean it the way that they are interpreting it, but it reminds them of something else, something that's happened to them before. And they overreact. They often overreact. A trauma researcher, Robert Storolov, says trauma plunges the person into recognition of death as a constant, threatening possibility, leading to the collapse of everyday significance. When one is traumatized, one can no longer have a normal sense of being in the world. Trauma is singularizing, isolative, and non-relational. Its terror is unendurable. And our kids, a certain group of kids are living with that every day, right? And we've not talked about that. We've not addressed that. So what is the prevalence of adverse childhood experiences? Well, 25% of the general population of 9 to 16-year-olds have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. 25%. 61% of African American youth have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. 93% of youth in juvenile detention have experienced at least one. And the majority of kids in the juvenile justice system have been exposed to 6 or more adverse childhood experiences, which that becomes known as complex trauma, when you have multiple incidents of trauma, one on top of the other. So what's the impact on academics? Well, these kids are less likely to start school on time. They don't perform as well in school. And kids who are not performing well have more discipline issues, as we've already talked about, and they have an increased likelihood of dropping out of school. So the trauma piece is something that has to be woven into a solution, right? If we have 61% of African American young people who have experienced trauma, then that's a significant number of kids who are in our schools who learn differently, who interact differently, who have different issues. And that has to be dealt with in a different manner. It has to be acknowledged, and it has to be intentionally planned for. Because otherwise, we're pushing more and more kids into the juvenile justice and criminal justice systems and out of our schools, right? Our goal, I think, our goal collectively as a community should be to have every single kid in our community graduate from high school. That should be our goal. If that's our goal, then we have to plan for that. And we have to execute those plans. And it's not just one thing, it's not one intervention, it's not one type of intervention, it's a number of different pieces have to be working together. And I'm going to walk through what some of those are. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about the work of Revision. Because this is the work that Revision has undertaken in Houston over the last few years. We're in our 6th year of our school-based programming in Houston. And our attempt was, well, the basic idea was, I began to realize, we deal with about 1,000 kids a year across all of our programs. And I began to realize that all of them had the same story, which is they started getting in trouble in elementary school. By late elementary school, they were being suspended, they were falling behind academically, and by middle school, they were so far behind that there was no possible way that they could catch up, and that's when they ended up in the juvenile justice system. The average Revision client, on the day that we meet them, which is in the juvenile detention center, on the day that we meet them is 3.5 years below grade level. How do you overcome that deficit? And so, with the GED being made as difficult as it is to pass now, even the GED becomes not an option. And so our kids are stuck without an education and without a path forward. And they ended up in the adult criminal justice system. I mean, that's the path that these kids are on. And so I said, okay, we've got to do something different. So we've got to find schools that will be willing to work with us and develop a plan. And so we have now worked with 4 school districts as a part of our Revision school-based program. And that school-based program has various elements. So first of all, our most important element is our mentoring program. And so Revision has 400 mentors that we recruit exclusively from faith communities. We are primarily working, Justin and I started it at a Methodist church in Houston, and so most of the churches that we have involved are Methodist or Episcopal churches. We have some other churches involved now, but these 32 faith communities have come together to join Revision, and they get trained as mentors, and then we assign them individually in schools as mentors with kids with the most discipline records, right? So we go to a school that has a high level of suspension and removals and a low success rate for African American and Latino kids. And we go to a principal and we say, give us the kids with the most discipline records, right? I want to go to the data. I don't want you to tell me who you think needs a mentor. That's a different question, right? A lot of kids need mentors. I want to go to the data and I want to see who are the kids with who are the worst kids in school, right? And that's the kids that we want to assign mentors to. What we found is that a lot of these school districts have very robust mentoring programs. And so they have a lot of volunteers that are serving as mentors. None of our kids had ever had a mentor before. They'd never been offered one. And they were told they didn't qualify. So those mentors see their students for 1 hour a week during the school day in the school building. All that is very important. We don't pull them from core classes, so we schedule it tightly around their non-core classes. And we like to start in middle school. We like to start with 6th and 7th graders because that's, to us, where the rubber meets the road. If we can get kids when they're in 6th grade, ideally, then if we can really begin to wrap services around them and show them support and compassion and also challenge them, then we can really begin to make a difference in their lives. The second component of that is we run a support group for that same group of students. So that support group, you see, does a few things, right? It creates a revision cohort in a school, right? So then they begin to know each other. They begin to identify with each other, right? And they begin to challenge each other. They begin to hold each other accountable because we talk about their discipline records. We talk about their academic records. We talk about, are you improving, right? The program is voluntary. We have a mentee recruiter that goes into a school and invites a student to participate. So it's entirely voluntary. If a student says, no, I don't want to participate, then it's just a no, right? It's fine. They don't have to. No one's making them. We don't even take court referrals. In our school-based program, I will say we have never had a student tell us they didn't want to participate, not even one. It happens sometimes on the juvenile justice side, but never in our school-based program. So that support group is run by a counselor, and it also meets for 1 hour a week during the school day. Again, not pulling kids from core classes. Usually that meets at lunch. Usually we eat lunch during the group. And that support group is a really important component to add to what the work that the mentor is doing. The third component is we provide some academic supports. So we have both a group of tutors, and then we tap into the tutoring and resources that the school has and make sure that kids are getting the academic supports that they need. So we're pulling their grades. We're getting parental permission to pull their grades and discipline records and attendance records every week. So we have access to that on an ongoing basis. So we're constantly checking and we're constantly giving feedback. Not in a negative way, but in a way like we want to help. We want to help you graduate from school. We make it very clear to everyone, all of our students, all the teachers, the principals, the parents, everyone, that our goal is to have these students graduate from high school. Right? That's our singular goal. We want them to graduate from their regular high school, not an alternative school, not a charter school, not the juvenile justice system, from their regular high school. That's our goal. And then the fourth component that we do is really revision strength, which is we do community activities. So soccer is an example of that. We also do softball. We have a breakdancing program. We do hip-hop education. We do all kinds of stuff. We take field trips. We go ice skating, everything. So we're getting them involved in activities that maybe they've never been involved in before. And again, we formed a cohort of them. Now the cohort includes their mentors as well as the kids, and they're all doing things together, right? So all of a sudden, we've revised the kids' view of themselves and the school's view of them, right? So when we began this program 6 years ago, we had pretty limited expectations. We were hoping that we could get some kids to stay in school long enough to actually get to high school, because our kids would always not get to high school. They would drop out, that ninth grade dropout thing. Well, I'll show you some results. So over the 6-year period, we've seen an 18% increase in attendance, 67% of our students have demonstrated a reduction in discipline records, and 63 of 65 of those students are still on track to graduate, and we had 14 students graduate from high school in May. 14 of them. None of those students have had any contact with the juvenile justice system at all since we began the program. None of them. So what we have proven, I think, is that these students can learn, right? They are perfectly capable of learning, and they can stay in school. They just need some extra supports, right? They need to be treated in a different way, and they need to be viewed in a different way. And in fact, of those 14 students that graduated, we now have 8 students who are in college. And of those 8, one of them was at the very top of the dean's list in the fall, last December. So that student, his name is Chris. I like to tell a story about him. So when we went to our very first school, we were just rolling out our school-based program. And we were at Northbrook Middle School, and he was a 7th grader. And I had asked for 10 kids from the principal. She came up with a list of 32, which, I mean, every school has, every school, when you say, give me your worst kids, every school has, they roll out lists. They got them off the top of their head. So when we got to I said, you got to pick 10. And so she said, okay, I'm going to give you these 10, but you got to take Chris. Chris is the worst student in the school. But I actually think he's really capable. I just think he's bored and he doesn't have any support at home. But I don't know if it's going to work because Chris, he's really hard to work with. So we took Chris, and we did find out that he could learn. And so Chris went from being literally the worst student in school to literally being the best student in high school. The best student in college, right? That's what these kids are capable of. If we can keep them on track, if we can help to join with them to keep them on track. One of our students said this. He said, I was in hell. The world was too big. I didn't have anybody to talk to. Revision turned my life upside down. Now I don't hang around with my homeboys anymore. Now I've changed what I wear and what I say. Now I want to go to college for criminal justice. Revision is my motivation, right? These students need motivation, and they need people in their corner. They need people to support them. They need people to join with them. And that's what our program and our school-based program has done, is we've created avenues for members of churches to connect to kids in their communities, in their neighborhoods, and stick with them, right? To believe in them and to stick with them. So our program is one promising program. There are others. And I want to mention sort of best practices around closing these gaps and ending the school-to-prison pipeline. The first thing I want to mention is the trauma-sensitive classroom. So this is a movement around the country that's an evidence-based approach to trauma. And the concept here is that you create a classroom by classroom environment in a school that is trauma-sensitive, trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive. So what can adults do for youth who've experienced adverse childhood experiences? Well, the first piece in a classroom is to create an environment of safety, right? These kids, as you heard, feel unsafe all the time. And that's legitimate, right? That's based on reality. That's based on fact. They have been unsafe. Bad things have happened to them. They have witnessed and experienced negative things, often violence. So you have to create a safe space where youth can retreat and be calm. That's inside the classroom, right? There has to be a safe space, a retreat space inside the classroom. You have to create a neat and uncluttered environment. And you have to have a structured and predictable routine. That's what these kids are looking for, something that's very structured and very predictable so that nothing bad will happen, right? They need to know that things are going to be okay. These kids prefer the use of more written instructions because they can understand that it's real if it's written down, and advance warning of any changes to the routine, so that you don't just spring changes on them. It's the sudden change that can trigger some of that trauma. Another thing that needs to happen is these kids need supportive adult relationships. So that's what we've learned from our kids, right? But the evidence points to that too. The research around adverse childhood experiences all points to connectedness being part of the solution to trauma. Trauma is at its root a core disconnectedness, right? And so we've got to find ways to reconnect them. And so that the supportive adult relationships inside the school building is really crucial, so that kids begin to see the school as a haven, the school as a safe place, the school as a place where they can get the support that they're looking for. And if adults get angry, you have to separate out your anger, not make it be about the kid. And yelling is the very last thing that you can do with these kids. I've learned that as a soccer coach with our soccer team. How do you coach a high school soccer team and never yell? Well, it's very difficult. But our kids don't respond. If I yell, they just shut down. And so I can't have a soccer team that's going to shut down, so I've had to learn not to yell and how to communicate with them without yelling. And then we've got to find strengths in our kids. We've got to build on their strengths. And so it doesn't matter what that strength is. It might be sports. It might be, athletics is often an avenue for kids that have experienced trauma. It might be music. It might be writing. A lot of our kids who have experienced trauma really like to write because it's a way to get those feelings out without having to tell someone the story. Telling the story over and over again is not good for people who've experienced trauma, but writing can often be that avenue. So we also have to help develop cultural identity and spiritual identity so that our kids have an outlet for where to put those feelings, where to put those emotions. So the church can be a really important factor in that. That's why we think that finding mentors that come from churches is so important, because the ideal then is we invite those kids to come to church too. Right? And maybe some of our kids join youth groups, which our kids have done, or we do our own Bible study for our kids on Wednesday nights at the Gethsemane campus. And they come, they're hungry for that. And again, that's something that's stable, it's something that's highly structured, it's something that they can count on. And through that, we build on their strengths. So creating that safe space in the school for kids who have experienced trauma is one component. Another is to create that positive school climate throughout the school. So the best evidence-based approach to that is PBIS. Are some of you familiar with PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention and Support? So it's an evidence-based school-wide program. It's not a discipline management system. It's often viewed as a discipline management system, but it's actually a lot more complex than that. You get the entire school staff trained in PBIS. It's a very complex training. And by the whole school staff, I'm talking about everybody. I'm talking about the custodians, the lunch ladies, the bus drivers. Everybody gets trained in PBIS. And you're rewarding positive behavior, you're building school connectedness, and you're providing extra supports for those few kids who require intense intervention, which is generally 1% to 8% of your student body. And so that's the kids that would normally get suspended or removed from campus. Instead of doing that, you wrap other supports around them, right? You provide them extra counseling or social work services, or you connect them to revision mentoring programs or other mentoring programs. You have a protocol. You change the protocols within the school so that you're dealing with it differently. And so it's not just about behavior. It's about academics, and it's about coaching. It's about the teachers as well and the staff, and giving them the adequate supports. This has been used around the country, and it's really the model program. If it's fully implemented well, it's hard to do a full implementation because you've got to have the teacher buy-in, and that can be challenging because teachers are accustomed to the code of conduct and things being done a certain way. But once this is fully implemented, if we can show teachers a school that has fully implemented it, you'll see a group of teachers that loves it, that they're the biggest advocates for it. Because it changes the culture of the school, and it becomes a positive place for everybody, not just for the students, but for the teachers as well. Another promising program are systems of care that are being rolled out in different school districts around the country. So the system of care is a collaborative approach to working with challenging students. And so, again, rather than suspending or removing them from school, you would refer them into a system of care, which is often school district employees. And they're not assigned to a certain school. Generally, they're district employees, and they are deployed to certain schools to work with students who are in need of extra support. And so they do life skills groups, family counseling, tutoring, mentoring, individual counseling, and pro-social activities. So that's a different approach. We've worked closely with a system of care program in Houston that has become very effective. They started out and they sort of weren't, nobody knew what it was or what the purpose of it was. But as they've become more entrenched in the school district, then schools call them when they have a student that they would normally suspend, or a student who's just constantly creating discipline issues for them. And then the system of care folks come and they do an assessment, and they determine what extra services that student needs, and then they deploy those extra services. And so that can be another effective approach. And these aren't necessarily done in isolation. A lot of these can work together. They work best in tandem. And then, of course, there's restorative discipline, which is, I know, something that the Chapel Hill Carrboro School District is rolling out. And I'm excited about that. I think you're going to see big things from that. So restorative justice as a school-wide discipline approach is its best implementation. So restorative justice in its fullest implementation actually replaces wholesale other school discipline systems, and it becomes the discipline system. So these talking circles like this become the mode that a school uses to resolve conflict and to deal with most discipline issues. And so the idea of a talking circle, this is from a teacher. Talking circles allow children to see their community as a place of significance, a place of positive change, and a place where their voices are heard. So in other words, let's say two students get into a fight. And rather than suspending both of those students, we're going to call a restorative justice circle right there on the spot. And a teacher's going to be a part of that. Maybe a principal is going to be a part of that. But the students are going to lead that. And they're going to talk through what caused that fight. What was the problem? Did we behave the way that we should have? What are we going to do differently? And how are we going to make this right? Right? How are we going to be accountable for our behavior? So there can be, it's not that there's no consequences, but it's that the consequences are determined by the students themselves, right? So that's a very promising approach. And it's a very promising approach that's being used right here in Chapel Hill in the schools. So more support of that, more rolling that out, more training around that, getting more people from the school involved in that is what's going to be necessary to make that a successful implementation. These restorative justice initiatives can be really impactful, or they can be somewhat impactful. And I'd love to see it be a really impactful one. And the last piece that I'll mention is the code of conduct. We've got to resolve the student code of conduct. And so there's a lot of models out there. There's a lot of school districts that have tackled this issue. This is what I think is worth looking at. You're not going to adopt this student code of, this is the Dignity in Schools model student code of conduct. So that Dignity in Schools spent a long time devising what would be the model student code of conduct, right, with very specific language in there. No district is going to adopt this, just wholesale. It's not designed for that. It's designed to inspire, well, what is possible in a student code of conduct, right? For some other models, the more implementation-oriented models, I would mention Denver. The Denver Public Schools did a complete overhaul of their student code of conduct and their discipline management system in the last few years, and it's very, very impressive. They've driven down those minority overrepresentation numbers, both in their discipline and their achievement gaps, and they've increased their graduation rates. And in the process, they've essentially eliminated suspensions and removals from school. It's very dramatic what they've done. And it's all available. They even train on it. Buffalo Public Schools is another one that's done something similar to that. Using this as a model, as an inspiration, I'll just give you an example from this model student code of conduct. In the Dignity in Schools model, it says, suspensions shall be prohibited for minor behavioral infractions, including but not limited to insubordinate behavior, disobedience, disrespect, or disruptive or rowdy behavior, classroom disruption, or other disruption of school activity. And then it replaces that with other components. So that's just an example. But again, I think our goal collectively has to be to have our students graduate from high school. Why is that the goal? Well, I think we in the education space, many of you in this room are educators. That's what we're about, right? We're about that. We're about that for all students. But we're also about it because it keeps kids and adults out of the adult criminal justice system. So a Northwestern study from 2014 shows us that 1 in 10 male high school dropouts are incarcerated. 1 in 10 male high school dropouts are incarcerated. 1 in 35 high school graduates are incarcerated. That's the difference. 1 in 4 African American male high school dropouts are incarcerated. 1 in 4. 1 in 35, I'll say it again, high school graduates are incarcerated. What is the single best thing that we can do to keep people out of the criminal justice system? It's to have them graduate from high school. My 30 years of experience tell me that in my gut, and the data shows us that as well. So the last book that I want to point out to you is one that I know Justin has talked to you about a whole lot, is our friend Father Greg Boyle's Tattoos on the Heart. And our friend, he was just in Houston last week, actually. And so this idea that he introduces in the book about kinship, that I think is the key concept. It's the key concept for me. It's the key concept for us in the church. It's the key concept for these kids. The idea of kinship. We, unfortunately, in our communities have created an otherization of African American young people. We've done that over a long period of time. It's no one person's fault. It's no one, you can't point to one thing and say, oh, this is what did it. It goes back a long way. But the antidote to that otherization is kinship. As Father Greg Boyle says, there's no daylight to separate us. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. We locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. At the edges, we join the easily despised and the readily left out. We stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop. We situate ourselves right next to the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. That, my friends, I think is our task. We are complicit in that. All of us are complicit in that now. And there are ways, lots of things that we can do to start contributing to a different path. And I hope that I can help be a part of that. The idea of mentoring these young people, going into a school and identifying the very students who are creating the most discipline issues in that school may seem daunting, but I can tell you from experience that it's actually a tremendous amount of fun. Because the expectations are very low, and they're easy to break through. They're easy to shatter because they're so low. And then once you have one success, they build on themselves and they support each other. And then all of a sudden, you've turned a corner. And the worst kids in a school become the center of the school and celebrated. And that is a joy to be a part of. It's a joy to watch. It's a joy to experience. That's what's possible. That's what's possible. So that's it. I want to have time for questions, so I wanted to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. Yes? Okay. Yes.
So I assume most of your mentors are white and most of your mentees are black. So how does that dynamic work out?
So there's a lot of research on that, and the research is not what you would expect. So the more recent research shows you that actually who the mentor is by age and gender and socioeconomic status is not really important. It's the posture that the mentor takes. If the mentor takes an open and honest and supportive posture, that's the only thing that matters. And so I'll respond to your question by giving you an example. So one of our mentors is an 80-year-old man named Ken. And we assigned him to mentor a 6'3" African-American young man named Cameron. And again, this was we often get stories from the principal at the time that she refers students. And so Cameron, she said, oh no, I don't think Cameron's going to really work out because he's very angry. So Ken met Cameron the first time, and Cameron told Ken the same thing. I don't think this is going to work out. I'm very angry. He used those exact same words. And he was. And those first couple of sessions were not, stellar, but they did find one common interest, which was basketball, and they both liked the Houston Rockets, and so Ken would bring the sports page, and they would look at the latest stories about the Rockets, and so that continued for 6 years. Cameron was one of those that graduated from high school and is now in college. So, and he has Thanksgiving dinner with Ken and his family to this day. So anything is possible. It's not about that. It's just about how we approach the kids and not about who we are or who they are.
Thank you so much for the conversation. I just had a question. You talked about the role of race in the school-to-prison pipeline. How do you think about the role of race in school climates and impacting student education outcomes? So I'm thinking about a focus on the system deficits. Your model seems to focus on student deficits, and I'm wondering how that plays in with the climate where the student still has to live and engage.
That's a crucial question. That's where I think you have to address the overall school climate, and you have to create that welcoming environment for every student. And that's where that's why I mentioned PBIS, because I think PBIS is the best approach to that, the best hands. I'm always looking for something that schools and districts can do, and that's something that they can do because it gets to creating a welcoming environment for everybody. And restorative justice is like that too, because if you're going to have a restorative justice circle, everybody's going to be included in that, and everybody's equal in that. It's not one person leading it. It's everybody being included in that. But it's a challenge, right? This is a challenge in all of our schools because we have an underrepresentation of African American teachers in a lot of our schools, so students don't see teachers that look like them. They don't know, a lot of our kids don't know people that lived in the neighborhoods that they lived in that have stories where they didn't end up incarcerated or they didn't end up on probation. So, there's a lot of pieces to that. But I think that, we have to start with some approach, and it has to be, yes, I think the individual approach, the student-led approach is one component of that, but you brought up the second piece of that, which is the school, the district has to look at that problem from a systemic lens and figure out what can be done about that. And I've just suggested a few approaches. There are others. But I think something tangible, commissioning a study or setting up a committee is not going to address the problem. We've got to do something. And we've got to use, I think, evidence-based approaches so we know that what we're going to do works. I hope that was responsive to your question.
So I am a teacher assistant in a third grade class here in Chapel Hill, and we've been doing PBIS in our school for so long that it's like we don't even think about it anymore. And of course, we've also started with the restorative practices. We do circles in our classroom whenever there's a conflict. The restorative practices training has given teachers a tool to be able to help resolve these things. So I think all of these things are really positive, and I'm very thankful that the Chapel Hill School District has taken that upon themselves. But my question is, how do you fold the families of these at-risk children into the mix? Because if they come to our school, that's a safe school and a welcoming school, and we give them academic support, we try to give them emotional support and all those other things, but then they go home and the parents they work 2-3 jobs. They may not even be in the home. They may live in a neighborhood that is dangerous. Their parents may not be able to give them the academic support. They come to school without homework. So to me, doing all of this in the school is wonderful, and we are dedicated to making it work, but how do you incorporate their family life so that they get the support at home that they also need to be successful?
That is it's a great question, and it's a very difficult one. And I would also add to your list that they may have an incarcerated parent. They may not be living with their parent at all. They may be living with an extended family member or a grandparent. And so, it is incredibly complex. I think something that we have found to be somewhat effective, I'm not saying it's a magic solution, but we started a parent support group a number of years ago for parents, where we provided sort of common sense mentoring for them as parents. And we did it at the church. We'd provide food and coffee and have it be on a night when other things were going on around the church, so there'd be childcare available and other activities. And sometimes parents participate in that, and sometimes that's been helpful. But finding something, like a lot of these parents or guardians need mentoring themselves, right? And I think we have to acknowledge that. They need support. I think providing that level of support is very, very important because I agree with you. We can do a lot for kids, especially in schools, but we also need to address the parents, because the kids don't live just at the school. They live, their whole life is lived out. Most of their life is lived outside the school. And I think we have seen some parent mentoring programs or some parenting programs. The best evidence-based curriculum that we use, that we have seen, and I would call your attention to it, is nurturing parenting. So it is an evidence-based approach. It's one of the blueprints approved, which is sort of the gold standard of evidence-based approaches in the youth space. And it does teach parents, and there's different age levels and different at-risk levels too. It does teach parents how to nurture their kids, and that is often what is lacking, because a lot of our parents were not nurtured as kids because they grew up with trauma. And so that may not be something that is top of the mind, but it's somewhat challenging to become certified in nurturing parenting, because you have to go to training. I mean, it's a curriculum, right? But it's really, really effective. And we have used it both with moms of kids who are incarcerated as well as in schools, and we found it to be really, really impressive. So, and then the third thing that I'll mention is just something that the city of Houston has been doing, which is that they have been running a food pantry inside schools, and they've been encouraging parents to come by telling them that if they come and participate in 2 activities in school during a week, they can get food every week from the food pantry. And so that's actually increased the number of parents that they have coming to stuff. So, I mean, it's a one-off. I can't speak for its long-term success, but it's an idea that I just wanted to mention. So, it's a great question. Yes.
Well, my name is Eric Taylor, and I'm the principal of Ephesus Elementary in Chapel Hill. Also the proud graduate of the HISD school system in Houston, Texas,
All right.
where my brother and my father and my father's side of the family currently still are. I wanted to actually help address that question. One of the things that, this is my first year at Ephesus, and one of the things that I talked to my staff about was winning the crowd. And some people, after they do something, they say, "Hey, Mr. Taylor, that was a great job winning the crowd." And then there's others that laugh at that. But when you talk about meeting the needs of at-risk families, and many families parents might be working or parent working 2 jobs, when you look at winning the crowd, some people see that as being very difficult because it takes consistency, it takes patience. When you talk about the 80-year-old with the 6'3" African-American, that came with consistency, that came with trust, that came with going outside of the box, that entails spending money, that entails inviting them over for Thanksgiving, but also before that, he probably made a trip to that young man's house. I'll never forget walking into a home and of a student, and they were selling drugs out of the home. And I just simply asked, "Hey, in the midst of them selling drugs, hey, can I borrow Tim so that we can go to Wake Forest for a campus visit?" And or another instance in which we went into the home. Now again, all this is liability, right? You're putting your job and your career on the line. But again, if you're really looking at that quote, and I have never seen that quote before, but by Father Gregory Boyle. I'm definitely looking that up when I leave here today. But I remember going to a home, and they have the picture. They had a picture framed, and it had proof on it. And you know how many of us, we would never frame a picture that had proof on it, but I was floored because how would a parent go get a frame and put a picture that has proof on the top of it? But you know what? You could still see the bottom of her daughter's head and the rest of her outfit. You couldn't see the top because it had proof on it. But you know what? That was the struggle that was there for them, and they were going to take that picture with proof or not on it, and they were going to post that into the room. That's the real struggle that we're dealing with. So when you talk about how you're going to make a difference, when you talk about PBIS, because we've been using it for years in Guilford County, where I'm coming from, and the restorative circles are great. But the truth of the matter is, if you're not willing to take a risk, if you're not willing to go to the hospital, like we went the other day, and that parent was in the hospital, she's going to be there for 2 weeks. And how many people visited her or her child, her little baby in the hospital, which means now she now cannot work. So how are they going to be eating over the next? And then how does that apply to the learning that's not going to take place for the other child or the other children? So when you really look at it, and I can't remember that quote directly, but being next to the garbage or the disposal, being close to them in order to keep them from, going in. I'll read that a little bit more. But it's going to be risky. It's going to be, for some, they're going to say, "Why are you doing that?" If that's something that you really want to grasp that family, if you can't grasp the trust, you don't have the opportunity. And that 80-year-old man had to get that from Cam to get that level of trust before he would ever walk and sit down and eat dinner at his table. So you're going to have to go outside the box, and you're going to have to win the crowd.
That's great. Thank you for that.
Maybe one more question, and then we'll close up.
Was there one over here that I missed?
I think he was right here, yeah.
So you've talked some about the importance of having people of faith involved in this and sharing that. Have the schools put any boundaries around your ability to share your faith experiences and to offer the students you're working with the opportunity to become part of the church communities of the mentors that they have? Or is it something that's been left more open to that individual relationship?
Well, we understand that we're not conducting church services inside the school and we're not having Bible studies on the school campus. We understand that. But, all of us are people of faith, and we say that from the beginning. We say that Revision is a faith-based program, and we're affiliated with churches, and so we go into it with transparency about who we are and what we're there doing, and we don't proselytize inside the school, but we can provide an invitation for kids to come to the church to do different things. And we run programs on our church campuses for kids and their families. And so that invitation is always extended, and it is often taken up. I mean, so we have to separate, like we're doing mentoring on the school campus, and we're doing the support group on the school campus, and the faith work is done in the church. But we've been really clear, and the school has been really welcoming of that approach, without any barriers. I think the kids are hungry for that. I think the families are hungry for that, and I think it's a deficit that we in our church can fill.
Well, thank you, Charles. We appreciate being here.
Thank you.
So we're going to be transitioning. We've got another meeting in here at 3:30, but and Charles has to run to the airport
Pretty soon, yeah.
pretty soon. But he'll be around for just a handful of minutes here, where you can speak with him and maybe ask 1 or 2 questions before he has to run out. But thanks for coming again.
Yeah, thank you. Let me give this back to you.